Imagine waking up completely trapped inside your own body. You cannot run, you cannot hide. You are entirely at the mercy of the person who swore to love and protect you. But what happens when that person turns out to be a monster? What happens when the man you married decides that you are no longer a wife, but a piece of property to be rented out for cold, hard cash? This is the story of Claire. She was a woman who lost everything to a tragic accident, only to face a nightmare far worse than her injuries. But sometimes salvation arrives in the darkest moments, wearing the face of a complete stranger. Sit back and prepare yourself for a story of ultimate betrayal, shocking secrets, and a twist of fate you will never see coming. Claire grew up as a ward of the state in a forgotten corner of Pennsylvania. She never knew her parents. Her only possession from her infancy was an old, beautifully embroidered blanket. Craving a normal life and a stable family, she married Todd. He was a local mechanic with a quick temper and a charming smile that soon faded. Just months into their marriage, a horrific fall on an icy staircase shattered Claire's spine. She was left almost entirely paralyzed. Instead of caring for her, Todd descended into heavy drinking and bitter resentment. He blamed her for ruining his life. He trapped her in a filthy, cramped apartment, subjecting her to daily psychological torment. Claire lost all hope. Her childhood best friend Liam was deployed overseas in the Navy, leaving her entirely isolated. She was a prisoner in a broken body and a broken home. But on one rainy Tuesday night, Todd's cruelty reached an unimaginable peak, setting off a chain of events that would shatter the walls of her prison. The sickly yellow glow of the hallway bulb flickered violently, casting long and distorted shadows across the peeling wallpaper of the bedroom. Claire lay completely frozen on the stained, lumpy mattress. The stale and suffocating scent of cheap bourbon, wet ash, and decaying garbage hung heavy in the damp air of the apartment. She could hear the heavy, uneven footsteps of her husband, Todd, echoing loudly on the scuffed hardwood floor outside her door. Her heart hammered against her fragile ribs like a trapped and terrified bird. Since the tragic accident on the icy stairs 6 months ago, her body had become a heavy, lifeless shell. She could not run away. She could not fight back. The brass doorknob rattled, producing a sharp metallic sound that violently cut through the silence. Todd's slurred, cruel laughter drifted through the thin wood of the door. He was not alone tonight. A second set of footsteps, quieter and much more deliberate, followed right behind him. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a God she barely believed in, that this was just a terrible nightmare. She prayed she would wake up in a safe place, but the cold draft creeping through the cracked glass of the window was entirely real. Todd pushed the door open with a violent shove. It hit the drywall with a sickening thud. He stood framed in the doorway, swaying slightly under the dim light. His grease-stained flannel shirt clung tightly to his thick, unwashed frame. A cruel, jagged smile stretched across his unshaven face. He looked at her not as his wife, but as a piece of discarded, worthless meat. Then Todd stepped aside, revealing the tall, broad-shouldered silhouette of the stranger standing directly behind him. The stranger was dressed in a sharp, dark wool coat that looked entirely out of place in this rotting, miserable apartment. Claire felt a cold, terrifying sweat break out across her pale forehead. Todd had threatened to do this a dozen times before. He had drunkenly threatened to sell her out to strangers to pay his mounting gambling debts. She never truly believed he was actually monstrous enough to go through with it. Now the absolute worst-case scenario was standing right inside her bedroom. Todd stumbled forward, the reek of alcohol radiating from his pores. He leaned over the bed, his bloodshot eyes glaring down at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. He told her not to worry, claiming with a sick laugh that she was finally going to be useful for once in her miserable life. The words struck Claire like physical blows to the chest. A sticky, paralyzing fear, mixed with the desperate realization of her own absolute helplessness, paralyzed her even more than her broken spine ever could. She could barely feel her own shallow breaths. Todd turned back to the man in the doorway. He complained loudly about how he was sick of taking care of a cripple. He whined that he was a young man who deserved better than being chained to a lifeless burden. Claire's fingers twitched weakly against the thin, washed-out blanket. It was the only movement she could manage, and it offered zero protection against the encroaching nightmare. Is this truly happening to me? Claire thought frantically. Is this not a hallucination brought on by the cheap pain medicine? Why is there absolutely no one who can hear my silent screams for help? The man who stood before her was the man who stood at an altar and promised to love, cherish and protect her in sickness and in health. Instead, he had morphed into a literal demon who fed on her suffering. Todd aggressively grabbed the edge of her blanket and ripped it away, leaving her exposed to the cold, drafty air. He ordered her to cooperate, his voice dripping with venom. He grabbed her fragile knees with rough, uncaring hands, squeezing so hard that a sharp jolt of pain shot up her spine. Claire let out a weak, raspy gasp. Somewhere in her mind she remembered reading that the human body could trigger a massive surge of adrenaline in moments of mortal danger. Perhaps that was happening now. Pushing past the overwhelming terror, she managed to lift her arms a few inches. She pushed against Todd's heavy hands, weakly demanding that he let her go. Her voice was nothing more than a broken whisper. It was an entirely futile effort. Pushing against him was like trying to move a brick wall with a feather. Todd simply laughed at her pathetic attempt at resistance. He sneered, mocking her weakness, entirely unbothered by her tears. Claire hated crying in front of him. It gave him a sick sense of satisfaction to see her break. The tears felt like the ultimate confirmation of her absolute degradation. "Please just let me go," Claire whispered, blinking rapidly to clear the hot tears blurring her vision. The humiliation burned hotter than the physical pain. It was the absolute concentration of all the psychological torture he had inflicted upon her over the past 6 months. But just as Todd raised his hand to strike her across the face, a sudden, surprisingly calm voice echoed through the small bedroom. The stranger stepped fully into the light. He spoke with a smooth, commanding authority, telling Todd that there was no need for violence. In the next fraction of a second, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The stranger grabbed Todd by the back of his greasy collar. With shocking, effortless strength, he ripped the heavier man away from the bed and shoved him violently across the room. Todd stumbled backward, his heavy boots slipping on the warm floorboards. He crashed hard into the cheap plywood wardrobe, knocking a dusty lamp to the floor. The bulb shattered with a sharp pop. Todd gasped, rubbing his bruised shoulder, staring at the stranger with wide, bewildered eyes. He stammered, asking what the hell the guy was doing. He reminded the stranger that they had a financial deal. The stranger adjusted the cuffs of his expensive coat perfectly calmly. He looked at Todd with an expression of absolute disgust. He stated firmly that he had indeed paid the agreed price. He declared that Todd's involvement was now completely finished. He ordered Todd to leave the room immediately. Now that the immediate threat of Todd was removed, Claire finally had a chance to properly look at the man who had supposedly just purchased her. He was noticeably taller than Todd, possessing a lean, athletic build, hidden beneath the tailored clothing. His dark blonde hair was perfectly swept back. He had high cheekbones, a straight nose, and intense eyes the colour of a stormy ocean. He was wearing subtle, wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an incredibly intelligent, calculating look. Beneath the wool coat, he wore a black cashmere sweater and dark, expensive jeans. Unlike Todd, who smelled of rot and decay, this man brought the scent of cedar wood, expensive citrus cologne, and crisp autumn air into the stale room. Claire felt a bizarre, hysterical thought bubble up in her mind. She concluded that the trauma had finally broken her brain entirely. Why else would she be admiring the physical attractiveness of a man who had just bought her for unspeakable purposes? In her terrifying situation, she knew she should be screaming for the police. She should be begging for mercy. She should not be noticing the elegant cut of her buyer's sweater. It felt like a twisted, dark parody of the romantic movies she used to watch on the rusty television in the living room. In those movies, the handsome hero always kicked down the door to save the damsel in distress. But in her twisted reality, the handsome hero was actually the villain. A weird, broken giggle escaped Claire's dry lips. The giggle quickly morphed into a full-blown fit of hysterical, breathless laughter. The stranger stared down at her, his stormy grey eyes slightly widened in genuine surprise. He did not look angry, merely fascinated by her sudden emotional break. Todd, however, was absolutely furious. He pushed himself off the broken wardrobe, his face red with alcoholic rage. He screamed at Claire to shut her mouth, calling her insane. He lunged forward, raising a heavy fist, fully intending to knock the laughter right out of her. But the stranger was faster. He casually extended a long arm, planting a firm, immovable hand against Todd's chest, stopping the drunkard dead in his tracks. Claire gasped for air, forcing her laughter to subside. She looked up at the handsome stranger, her chest heaving. Through her tears of panic and mirth, she demanded to know why he would do this. She pointed out that a man of his obvious wealth and striking looks could have any woman in the city for free. She asked why he would pay a premium to buy a broken, paralyzed woman in a filthy apartment. She flatly accused him of being some kind of sick, twisted deviant. Her words hung in the air, blunt and desperate. The stranger did not flinch. He did not yell. He simply took a slow, deep breath, maintaining his intensely calm demeanour. Todd snarled from the corner, threatening to beat her senseless for ruining his payday. He yelled that she owed him her life because he had not dumped her in a state nursing home. He told her she was going to earn her keep starting tonight. The stranger turned his head slowly toward Todd. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. With a voice made of pure, chilled steel, he ordered Todd to get out of the room. He reminded Todd that the money had already been transferred. He stated that the transaction was complete, and he required absolute privacy with his new acquisition. Todd swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his thick throat. The drunken bravado was rapidly draining from his system, replaced by a primal realization that the man standing before him was incredibly dangerous. Todd muttered a weak curse, completely intimidated by the stranger's icy authority. He shot one last, confusing glare at his paralyzed wife, a mixture of greed and slight hesitation crossing his features. Then he turned and scurried out of the bedroom, pulling the door shut behind him. The heavy click of the latch echoed loudly in the quiet room. Claire was left entirely alone with the mysterious buyer. She felt as though she were lying in an open grave, waiting for the dirt to fall. She was no longer laughing. She was no longer crying. She simply stared up at the man, completely incapable of processing the terrifying reality of her situation. How had her life come to this exact moment? She tried to trace back the steps, looking for the specific tragic turn that led her to this bed. It all felt like a rapid, uncontrollable descent into hell. She braced herself for the inevitable assault, her weak muscles tensing in anticipation. To understand how Claire ended up in this nightmare, one had to look back at the very beginning of her lonely existence. Her life started as a mystery. She was found abandoned on the cold concrete steps of a local grocery store in the middle of a brutal winter storm. She was wrapped tightly in a peculiar, high-quality linen blanket. The local authorities brought her to the county orphanage. The tired nurses speculated that she was the unwanted child of a wealthy teenager, or perhaps stolen and abandoned. They tried to trace the origin of the blanket, but the leads quickly went completely cold. The state gave her the name Claire, and she was assigned the incredibly generic last name of Smith. Claire Smith grew up as a quiet, observant girl without a past and with a very uncertain future. She spent her entire childhood and teenage years inside the drab, institutional walls of the orphanage. She was a good student. She never caused any trouble, never picked fights, and always completed her chores. But she was never the centre of attention. She faded into the background, a perfectly average girl living a perfectly average, lonely life. When she finally turned 18, the state handed her a small stipend, a garbage bag full of cheap clothes, and the keys to a tiny subsidised apartment. She was thrust into the real world with absolutely no idea how to navigate it. The freedom she had dreamed of felt incredibly overwhelming and utterly terrifying. The only source of true happiness in Claire's early life had been a boy named Liam. Liam was a fellow orphan, 2 years older than Claire, with a fiery spirit and a heart of pure gold. Unlike Claire, Liam knew exactly who his parents were. They had been severe addicts who lost custody of him and eventually died of overdoses before he turned 15. Liam became Claire's fierce protector and her absolute best friend. They spent hours sitting on the rusty fire escape of the orphanage, making wild promises about the future. Liam dreamed of the ocean. He constantly talked about joining the Navy, wanting to travel the world and leave the bleakness of the orphanage far behind. Claire, on the other hand, had much simpler dreams. When Liam asked her what she wanted, she shyly admitted she just wanted a normal family. She wanted a loving husband, a small house with a backyard, and a chaotic kitchen full of happy children. She wanted everything she had been denied. Liam would smile, playfully tug her hair, and promise to come back and dance at her wedding. Secretly, in the quiet corners of her heart, Claire wished Liam would be the man waiting for her at the altar. But she knew they wanted entirely different things from life. When Liam turned 18, he left for boot camp. Claire felt as though a massive piece of her soul had been ripped away. She lived for his sporadic letters and brief phone calls from exotic ports. Shortly after moving into her lonely apartment, Claire found a grueling job at an industrial textile warehouse. She worked long hours inspecting fabrics, surrounded by the deafening roar of machinery. It was during a rainy commute on a crowded city bus that she met Todd. He offered her his seat when the bus hit a sharp pothole. When she politely thanked him, he flashed a charming crooked smile and boldly asked for her phone number. He told her she looked incredibly unique. Claire, who had zero experience with men, was deeply flustered. She was used to being invisible. In the orphanage, other girls had dramatic romances, but Claire was always the wallflower. A harsh girl at the orphanage once told Claire she dressed like a grandmother from the 1950s, favouring long floral skirts and plain sweaters. Claire did not care. She liked being comfortable. But Todd's sudden attention threw her off balance. She initially refused to give him her number, telling him that good deeds should not come with a price tag. She turned away, proud of her boundary, but Todd was incredibly persistent. He saw her rejection as a challenge. He followed her off the bus, matching her brisk pace down the wet sidewalk. He boldly declared that he was going to see her again. Claire thought he was crazy, but a small, desperate part of her was deeply flattered by the relentless pursuit. Todd kept showing up. He waited outside the textile warehouse at the end of her shifts. He brought her cheap coffee and constantly complimented her. Claire eventually wore down. She mistook his aggressive pursuit for genuine, passionate love. Looking back, she realized she was simply desperate to not be completely alone. The aching void left by Liam's deployment made her incredibly vulnerable to Todd's calculated affection. She hoped Liam might change his mind, quit the Navy, and come back for her. But weeks turned into months. Todd proposed after just 2 months of dating. He claimed he wanted a small, cheap wedding, stating he hated his own family and didn't want a showy party. Claire agreed, sympathetic to his family issues. Todd's parents were divorced and he openly despised his stepfather. Moving into Claire's apartment gave him a free place to live and a maid to clean up after him. The wedding was a miserable, depressing affair held in a dingy local diner. Claire wore a cheap, cream-coloured dress made of synthetic silk. She had dreamed of a massive vanilla cake with fresh strawberries, but Todd refused to pay for it. They ate stale apple pie instead. Todd's parents showed up, handed them a cheap set of frying pans, and left within 20 minutes. Even Claire's older co-worker, Sarah, who had become a mentor to her at the warehouse, warned Claire that Todd seemed like a controlling tyrant, but Claire was too blind and too lonely to listen. Married life quickly became an exhausting, suffocating routine. Todd demanded hot meals the second he walked through the door, regardless of how many hours Claire had worked at the warehouse. He constantly belittled her, criticizing her spending habits and mocking her quiet nature. Aside from their dreadful wedding night, Todd showed zero romantic interest in her. He treated her entirely like an unpaid servant, Claire often woke up in the middle of the night to find him standing by the window, staring into the dark street with a terrifying, hollow expression. She was too frightened to ask him what was wrong. She simply hid under the covers, pretending to be asleep, waiting for the morning light. She found her only escape in watching romantic movies on the weekends, while Todd was out drinking with his mechanic buddies. She desperately wished for a hero to sweep her away, but accepted that this miserable existence was her permanent reality. Then came the terrible Saturday that ruined everything. Claire had returned to the apartment to grab her forgotten wallet before heading to the store. As she quietly pushed the door open, she heard Todd on the phone with his mother. He was brutally mocking Claire. He called her a pathetic, stupid orphan. He told his mother he was only using Claire for free rent and a hot meal, and planned to divorce her the moment he saved up enough cash. The absolute cruelty in his voice completely shattered Claire's fragile heart. Blinded by tears and suffocating from the horrific betrayal, Claire practically ran out of the apartment building. She did not know where she was going. She just walked aimlessly through the freezing rain, her mind reeling from the realization that her entire marriage was a cruel, calculated lie. The wet leaves on the sidewalk were incredibly slick. As she approached a short concrete staircase leading down to a public park, her worn-out boots lost their grip. She slipped wildly, her arms flailing in the empty air. She fell hard, twisting backward. The sickening crack of her spine hitting the sharp edge of the concrete step echoed in her ears. The pain was absolute white-hot agony. Then everything below her waist went entirely numb. A panicked pedestrian rushed over, frantically dialing for an ambulance. Claire lay in the freezing puddles, unable to move a single muscle, staring up at the grey, weeping sky. She tried to tell the stranger she just needed to rest for a minute, panicking about needing to wash Todd's work clothes, but her vision faded to black before the paramedics even arrived. When she woke up in the sterile hospital room days later, the doctors delivered the devastating news. The spinal cord damage was catastrophic. Barring experimental, incredibly expensive treatments, she would likely never walk again. She was permanently paralyzed. Todd visited her exactly twice. He brought her insurance papers, stared at her with open disgust, and complained about the hospital parking fees. When the hospital finally discharged her, Todd begrudgingly brought her back to the apartment. He roughly shoved her wheelchair over the threshold, nearly knocking her out of the seat. The curious cab driver who helped them unload the chair offered a few words of kindness, but Todd practically chased the man away. Once the door was closed, Todd unleashed his fury. He screamed that she had ruined his life. He complained endlessly that he was now forced to be a nursemaid to a useless cripple. Since they had no money for a home health aide, Todd was entirely responsible for her care. He did it with maximum cruelty, leaving her in soiled clothes for hours, tossing cheap food at her, and ensuring she felt like an absolute burden. Claire's only lifeline was Sarah, her friend from the warehouse. Sarah visited whenever she could, bringing fresh groceries and cleaning the apartment while Todd was out drinking. But then, Sarah was forced to leave town to care for her own dying mother in another state. Claire was left entirely alone in the dark. Todd's drinking escalated dramatically. He began openly bringing cheap liquor into the bedroom, taunting her. He constantly threatened to dump her in the worst, most abusive state-run nursing home he could find. Claire was terrified of institutions. She clung to the fading hope that somehow, against all medical odds, she might regain some movement. But the reality of her dark, abusive prison was rapidly breaking her will to live. Back in the present moment, Claire braced herself on the mattress, staring up at the stranger named Harrison. She waited for him to assault her, but he did not move. Instead, he slowly and gracefully sat down on the very edge of her bed. He kept a respectful distance. He looked at her with an expression that held no malice, only a deep, profound sympathy. He told her she was completely right. He stated in a smooth, rich voice that he did not pay men like Todd for the kind of services Todd was offering. Harrison took a deep breath and looked directly into her terrified eyes. He told her he was not there to hurt her. He was there to save her and to offer her an entirely new life. Claire blinked rapidly. her mind struggling to process the completely illogical statement. She asked him what he meant, her voice trembling. Harrison held up a hand gently, asking if she would answer just one very specific question first. He asked if she had grown up in the county orphanage. Claire nodded slowly, highly suspicious. Harrison leaned forward slightly. He asked her about the blanket she was found wrapped in as a baby. He asked if she still possessed it, and if she knew what was embroidered on the edges. Claire was completely stunned. How could this wealthy, intimidating stranger possibly know about the single secret artifact from her mysterious infancy? The absurdity of the question momentarily overrode her paralyzing fear. Claire's breathing hitched as she answered him. She told him about the old nurse at the orphanage who had saved the blanket from being thrown away. The nurse had always joked that Claire must be a lost princess because the linen was incredibly soft and expensive. She told Harrison that the embroidery was highly unusual. It featured silver mockingbirds perched on delicate branches, woven into a deep navy blue silk border. Harrison's stormy grey eyes widened with intense validation. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, as if a massive weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. He asked her where the blanket was. Claire pointed a trembling finger toward the bottom shelf of the broken wardrobe across the room. She told him it was in a cardboard box hidden under some old sweaters. Harrison immediately stood up, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and pulled the box out. He opened it carefully, pushing aside old report cards and faded photographs until his fingers brushed against the incredibly soft fabric. He pulled the blanket into the light. He stared at the silver mockingbirds shimmering under the broken bulb. A look of profound satisfaction washed over his handsome features. He turned back to Claire, clutching the blanket gently. He nodded firmly. He told her that he had finally found her. He announced that he was going to take her out of this miserable apartment tonight and that she would never have to see her abusive husband ever again. Claire's mind was spinning so fast she felt nauseous. She weakly demanded an explanation. She asked who he was and why a baby blanket meant anything to him. Harrison stepped back to the bed and knelt down so he was completely at eye level with her. He reached out and very gently took her cold, fragile hand in his warm one. The contact sent a strange, electric shock of comfort straight through her nervous system. It was the first gentle touch she had felt in over half a year. He introduced himself formally as Harrison Vance, a senior partner at a high-end corporate law firm based in New York City. He explained that he was the executor of a massive estate. He promised to explain the entire unbelievable story, but insisted that this freezing, filthy apartment was absolutely not the place to have a multi-million-dollar legal discussion. He told her that Todd was no longer a factor. He had paid Todd enough cash to ensure the drunkard would drink himself into a stupor at the local bar for the next month. Harrison offered her a choice. She could stay here and wait for Todd to eventually return, or she could trust him, a complete stranger, and let him carry her to safety. Claire looked around the rotting room. She looked at the peeling paint and the empty bottles. She looked back at Harrison's steady, honest eyes. It was a massive, insane risk, but she had absolutely nothing left to lose. She whispered her consent. She told him she was ready to leave. Harrison did not waste a single second. He moved with incredible efficiency. He grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began rapidly packing her few essential items. He packed her medications, her few decent clothes, and carefully folded the silver mockingbird blanket, placing it right on top. Once the bag was zipped, he returned to the bed. He warned her that he needed to lift her, promising to be as incredibly gentle as possible. He slid one strong arm beneath her fragile shoulders and the other beneath her knees. With smooth, practiced ease, he lifted her from the terrible mattress. Claire felt weightless. For the first time since her devastating fall, she did not feel like a broken, heavy burden. She felt entirely safe. Harrison carried her out of the bedroom and into the narrow, dark hallway. As they passed the tiny kitchen, Claire saw Todd, sprawled face down on the greasy linoleum floor. He was completely unconscious, softly snoring in a puddle of spilled alcohol. Harrison had not just paid him. He had clearly ensured Todd would be out cold for hours. Harrison navigated the cramped apartment effortlessly. He kicked the front door open and carried her out into the harsh fluorescent light of the apartment building's main corridor. Just as he stepped out, the door across the hall cracked open. Mrs. Higgins, the building's notorious gossip, poked her head out. She was wearing a violently pink bathrobe and clutching a small dog. Mrs. Higgins's jaw practically hit the floor when she saw the incredibly handsome man in the expensive suit carrying the paralyzed girl from 4B. Her eyes darted from Harrison's tailored coat to Claire's bewildered face. Harrison flashed the old woman a brilliant, absolutely disarming smile. He smoothly explained that he was a private medical transport specialist hired by Claire's distant relatives. He claimed they were moving her to an elite rehabilitation facility upstate. He asked Mrs. Higgins if she would be so kind as to close Claire's apartment door behind them, mentioning that Todd was currently resting and should not be disturbed. Mrs. Higgins, completely thoroughly charmed by Harrison's deep voice and professional demeanour, eagerly agreed. She stepped out and pulled the door shut until the deadbolt clicked. She wished Claire good luck, completely oblivious to the dramatic rescue taking place right in front of her. Harrison thanked her profusely and carried Claire down the 3 flights of stairs. When they reached the street, the cold, pouring rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the streetlights. Parked illegally at the curb was a massive, gleaming black luxury SUV. The windows were heavily tinted. Harrison opened the rear door with a remote control. The interior smelled of expensive leather and subtle air freshener. He gently settled Claire across the spacious back seat, arranging a soft cashmere throw over her legs. Harrison loaded her single duffel bag into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The powerful motor purred silently. As they pulled away from the curb, leaving the miserable, decaying neighbourhood behind, in the rearview mirror, Claire felt a massive wave of exhaustion crash over her. She asked Harrison if she could use his phone. She needed to tell someone she was alive. Harrison smoothly handed her his sleek, expensive smartphone without hesitation. Claire dialed Sarah's number from memory. When Sarah picked up, Claire quickly explained that she had left Todd. Sarah practically screamed through the speaker, demanding to know where she was and if she was safe. Claire admitted she was in a car with a wealthy stranger she had just met. Sarah panicked, threatening to call the police immediately. Harrison calmly asked Claire to put the phone on speaker. He spoke directly to Sarah, projecting absolute professional authority. He provided his full name, the name of his prestigious law firm, his bar association number, and the license plate of the vehicle. He assured Sarah that Claire was entirely safe and that Sarah was welcome to visit the estate the very next morning. His absolute transparency finally managed to calm Sarah down. Claire ended the call, handing the phone back. She stared out the window as the city lights blurred into the dark, towering trees of the wealthy northern suburbs. She was completely numb, unable to comprehend the massive shift in her reality. The drive took over 2 hours. Claire drifted in and out of a light, exhausted sleep. When she finally opened her eyes, the SUV was slowing down. They were turning off a quiet, winding country road. Massive wrought iron gates materialized out of the dark woods. Harrison pressed a button on the overhead console, and the heavy gates swung open silently. The driveway was lined with ancient, towering oak trees lit by elegant ground lights. The SUV rounded a gentle curve, and Claire gasped out loud. Sitting on a massive, perfectly manicured lawn was an absolutely breathtaking 3-story stone mansion. It looked like a castle straight out of a European fairy tale. Warm, inviting light spilled from the massive, arched windows. Harrison parked the car under a grand portico. He came around, opened the door, and once again lifted Claire effortlessly into his arms. He carried her up the wide stone steps and into the grand foyer. The interior was stunning. Sweeping double staircases wrapped around a massive crystal chandelier. The floors were polished marble. It felt incredibly warm and smelled faintly of expensive wood polish and fresh lilies. A professional-looking, older woman in a neat uniform hurried forward. Harrison introduced her as Martha, the head housekeeper. He instructed Martha to prepare the primary guest suite on the ground floor. He carried Claire into a massive, luxurious bedroom, adorned with soft lavender silks and a roaring fireplace. He placed her incredibly gently onto the massive, cloud-like bed. Martha quickly arranged the pillows to support Claire's back and brought a tray with hot chamomile tea and fresh pastries. Claire felt completely overwhelmed by the absolute luxury surrounding her. It was a sensory overload compared to the mouldy walls she had stared at for months. Once Martha left them alone, Harrison pulled up a velvet chair and sat beside the bed. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across his sharp features. He told Claire that it was time she knew the absolute truth about who she was. He poured himself a small glass of water and began to speak. He started by telling her about a man named Richard Vance. Richard was a ruthless, brilliant real estate mogul who built a multi-billion-dollar empire entirely from scratch. Like Claire, Richard was an orphan. He trusted almost no one and spent his entire life obsessively hoarding wealth. But 22 years ago, during a lavish business trip to Miami, Richard attended a high-society charity gala. It was there that he met a young, incredibly beautiful runway model named Evelyn. Evelyn was wearing a stunning dress, decorated with silver mockingbirds. Richard fell completely and obsessively in love with her. They spent a whirlwind weekend together, hidden away in a luxury penthouse. Richard thought he had finally found a piece of happiness, but Monday morning, Evelyn completely vanished. She left no note, no forwarding address, and no explanation. Richard was completely devastated and eventually returned to his cold, isolated life in New York. Harrison's voice softened as he continued the story. He explained what Richard did not know. Evelyn was trapped in a highly abusive contract with a corrupt modelling agency. When her managers found out she was pregnant with a billionaire's child, they panicked. They feared Richard would ruin them for exploiting her. They forced Evelyn to hide. When the baby was born, Evelyn's strict controlling parents were horrified by the scandal. They ripped the newborn girl from Evelyn's arms immediately after birth. They drove 3 states away and abandoned the baby on the steps of a random grocery store, wrapping her only in the custom silver mockingbird blanket Evelyn had begged them to leave with the child. Evelyn's heart was entirely broken. She spiraled into severe depression and tragically passed away from illness just 3 years later. The baby, of course, was Claire. For 22 years, Richard had absolutely no idea he had a daughter. But 6 months ago, Richard was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Facing the end of his life, he hired elite private investigators to find Evelyn, hoping to apologize for not protecting her. The investigators uncovered the horrific truth about the forced adoption and tracked the blanket directly to the county orphanage. They found Claire's records. Richard discovered his daughter was alive, working in a textile warehouse and married to a mechanic. He immediately changed his will, leaving his entire massive fortune, his companies, and this very estate to his only child. But fate, Harrison explained grimly, was incredibly cruel. Before Richard could reach out to Claire, before he could send his lawyers to rescue her from her miserable life, he suffered a massive fatal stroke. He died alone in this very house. Harrison, as Richard's most trusted protégé and executor of the estate, was legally bound to find Claire and deliver the inheritance. Harrison admitted that he had been secretly observing her for the past week. He had rented an apartment across the street from Todd's building. He wanted to ensure she was actually Richard's daughter before dropping a billion-dollar empire into her lap. He had watched Todd's abusive behavior escalate. When Todd desperately approached Harrison outside the building earlier that evening, drunkenly offering to rent his paralyzed wife to a wealthy stranger for cash, Harrison realized he could wait no longer. He used the opportunity to gain immediate access to the apartment, pay off the abusive husband, and secure Claire's absolute safety. Claire sat entirely frozen among the silk pillows, her mind completely shattered by the revelation. She was not a forgotten nobody. She was the sole heiress to a massive empire. Her father had loved her mother. He had spent his final days desperately trying to find her. The tears she had held back all night finally broke free. She sobbed, mourning the parents she never knew and the father she was just weeks too late to meet. Harrison gently handed her a linen handkerchief, sitting quietly while she processed the monumental shift in her universe. The following weeks passed like an incredibly vivid, fast-paced dream. True to his word, Harrison managed every single detail of Claire's transition. He completely shielded her from the aggressive media and handled the incredibly complex legal paperwork regarding the estate. He also assigned elite corporate lawyers to aggressively serve Todd with divorce papers, effectively threatening the man with extortion charges if he ever dared to contact Claire again. Todd, terrified by the massive legal machine aiming at his head, signed the papers and quietly vanished into the local dive bars. Claire's immediate focus, however, was her health. Harrison spared absolutely no expense. He converted the entire ground floor of the mansion into a state-of-the-art medical facility. He hired the best neurologists and physical therapists in the country. The doctors admitted that her spinal cord was severely damaged, but they introduced cutting-edge experimental therapies and intensive daily regimens. Claire worked tirelessly. The luxurious environment, proper nutrition, and the complete absence of daily psychological terror worked miracles on her spirit. Slowly, incredibly slowly, sensation began to return to her lower extremities. The first time she managed to wiggle her big toe, she cried tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Harrison was standing right there in the room, cheering her on. He had transitioned from her legal guardian to her fiercest protector and closest confidant. They spent long evenings by the fire, with him teaching her the intricate details of her new corporate empire. Sarah, Claire's loyal friend from the warehouse, arrived at the estate entirely shocked by the unbelievable transformation. Claire immediately hired Sarah to be her personal assistant, effectively doubling her old salary and offering her a beautiful cottage on the estate grounds. But the most emotional reunion was yet to come. 4 months into Claire's rigorous recovery, a sleek black car pulled up the sweeping driveway. Claire was sitting on the grand terrace in her custom wheelchair, wrapped against the autumn chill. A tall man in a crisp white navy uniform stepped out of the vehicle. It was Liam. He had finally returned from his extended deployment, only to find Claire's old apartment completely abandoned. He had frantically tracked down Sarah, who directed him to the estate. Liam ran up the marble steps, dropping his duffel bag on the expensive stone. He fell to his knees in front of Claire's wheelchair, burying his face in her hands, completely overwhelmed by the sight of her. He confessed that the moment he heard about her horrific accident and her abusive marriage, he felt his heart physically break. Looking up at her with tears streaming down his face, Liam finally admitted the truth he had hidden since their days at the orphanage. He told her he had always loved her. He had only joined the Navy because he thought he wasn't good enough for her. He swore, right there on the terrace, that he would never leave her side again. Claire's heart soared. The quiet, simple dream she had harboured since childhood was finally coming true, albeit in a setting she could never have imagined. Surrounded by the immense wealth of her late father, protected by the brilliant legal mind of Harrison, and finally held by the man she had always truly loved, Claire began her new life. Over the next 2 years, the estate transformed from a quiet, solitary mansion into a vibrant, bustling home. Claire's intensive therapy yielded incredible results. While she still relied on a stylish cane for long distances, she was no longer confined to the wheelchair. She walked down the aisle of the estate's massive rose garden on her own 2 feet, wearing a stunning designer gown, with Harrison proudly walking her down the aisle to give her away to Liam. Sarah stood by her side as her maid of honour. Claire took the reins of her father's charitable foundation, dedicating millions of dollars to improving the state orphanage system, ensuring no child would ever feel as invisible and unwanted as she once had. Todd, meanwhile, entirely ruined his own life. Without Claire to abuse and use for free housing, his heavy drinking led to a massive stroke. He ended up paralyzed and alone in the exact same miserable stateroom facility he used to threaten Claire with. The universe had delivered its own brutal, poetic justice. Claire never thought of him again. She was far too busy living the incredibly beautiful, deeply loved life she had always deserved. Claire's journey from a paralyzed, abused prisoner in a rotting apartment to a powerful, beloved heiress is a testament to the incredible twists of fate. She survived the darkest depths of human cruelty, only to discover that her life possessed an unimaginable value she never knew existed. Her father's wealth gave her the resources to heal, but it was her own unbreakable spirit that allowed her to truly rebuild her life. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story. If Claire's journey touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories like this. Don't forget to leave a comment below. What would you have done if you found out you were the secret heir to a billionaire? Let us know. Stay strong, keep hoping, and we will see you in the next video.